Famous author Paul Sheldon has completed his most recent untitled book in the Silver Creek Lodge in Silver Creek, Colorado. Paul is the author of a popular line of Victorian-era romance books featuring the heroic figure Misery Chastain. When Paul gets home from finishing the book, a snowfall causes him to lose control of the vehicle and veer off the road, shattering both of his legs and dislocating his shoulder. A flashback shows Paul speaking with Marcia Sindel, his literary agent, who scolds him for murdering off the protagonist of his most recent book, Misery's Child. Paul says he's going to Colorado to write the new novel and that if he hadn't murdered Misery, he would have ended up writing her forever. Paul is knocked out in the present, but Annie Wilkes, a retired nurse who lives not far from Silver Creek, saves him by taking him to her remote house. With a cache of codeine-based medications known as Novril, food that she has hoarded, and her nursing talents, Annie gradually restores Paul's health. Declaring herself to be Paul's #1 fan, she spends a great deal of time talking about him and his books. In the meantime, Marcia phones Silver Creek Sheriff Buster to report Paul's disappearance after not hearing from him. Buster claims that nothing has been heard from her, but he will still contact Marcia and enter Paul's name into the system. But Buster's system is sticking a post-it note on the wall to remind himself of Paul Sheldon. Marcia is ignorant that the Silver Creek Constabulary is less advanced than the NYPD. Annie wants to read Paul's most recent book, which she rescued from the wreckage, while he is shaving his face, and Paul grants her request. Annie tells him the book is good, but she doesn't like how much swearing there is in it while she is serving him soup. She becomes angered and spills his soup, but immediately regains her cool and apologizes. One day, on a car ride, Buster and his wife Virginia are driving down the same road that Paul was driving before he crashed and find a tree with a broken limb. Buster climbs down the hill a little to look around, but climbs back up when he sees nothing. The car is completely covered by snow out of sight, except for one tire, which Buster is unable to see. As they are getting back in the car to go to the newspaper office, Annie passes by them in her car. Annie returns home and tells Paul that she purchased Misery's Child. To Paul's question, "Are all the roads open?" Annie answers, "Just the one leading into town." She claims to have called the agent in addition to the hospital, telling them about Paul and what had transpired. When Paul inquires about the phone's functionality, Annie replies that while hers is still out of commission, the ones in town are. Annie says the publisher promised to let her know Paul was all right, but Paul is worried about his daughter and the fact that it was her birthday. As Annie progressed through the book, she gives Paul glowing praise, giving him good food, and introducing him to her pet pig Misery. At one point, she tells Paul that when her husband left her, she dove into work at the hospital where she first discovered Misery. Annie finishes Misery's Child, and after discovering Misery has died in childbirth, flies into a rage, threatening to hit him with a small table. She smashes it against the wall above his head instead. As she is about to leave, she reveals that she never called the doctors, his agent, or his family, and no one knows where he is. She also says he should hope nothing happens to her, because if I die, you die, then leaves, roaring off in her Jeep. Paul gets out of bed, slamming his legs painfully on the floor and tries to escape, but finds the door locked. The following morning, Buster had written a story about Paul's disappearance in the newspaper. While Virginia is on the other line and informs Buster that she has asked for a credit check on Paul Sheldon, he is talking with Marcia and indicates that nothing has been reported as of yet. He used his credit card for the first time recently to pay his payment at Silver Creek Lodge. After an unspecified period of time, Annie returns and assists Paul in getting back into bed. She apologizes for abandoning him and not caring about him, but she won't help him unless he fulfills a requirement. He has to burn his untitled work as retribution for killing her favorite character. He burns his bed after some hesitation and Annie squirting charcoal lighter fluid all over it. Then Buster's chopper, searching for Paul, flies by overhead. After giving Paul his novel, Annie departs with the burned manuscript remnants. What happens next is that Paul starts hoarding his painkillers. When Paul is well enough to get out of bed, Annie brings in a typewriter without the N key and sets up a small table. She then declares that Paul is going to write a new book called Misery's Return, which will bring the character back to life. She also declares that a book will be written in her honor for rescuing him and bringing him back to wellness. But when Paul says that Annie bought a brand of smudge-proof paper, Annie becomes mad and slaps the paper down on his lap, exacerbating the agony in his legs. She chastises him even more before hurriedly leaving to grab him some better paper. But Paul discovers one of her bobby pins on the ground and makes use of it to open the door and make his getaway. The front door is locked when he tries it. When he picks up the phone in the living room, it's completely broken. He knocks a ceramic penguin off the table in the living room, catches it, and puts it back on with its face turned in a different direction. He takes a packet after discovering a tiny closet full with many dozen sample novel boxes. The wheelchair won't fit through one of the kitchen doors, so he has to crawl to it, only to discover it's locked. He notices a pair of knives there. When he hears Annie's car coming, he scrambles to return to his room before Annie gets inside. When Paul's car is discovered, the police believe Paul is dead. But Buster isn't buying it. He claims Paul didn't get out, and that dents on the door, which were caused by Annie prying it open with a crowbar, lead him to believe someone else pushed Paul out. Paul makes a small pocket for himself in his bed, using a piece of paper from the pad Annie had given him. He hopes to unconscious Annie by pumping the contents of multiple novel capsules into his pocket. Then he starts writing the book because he thinks Annie will murder him if he doesn't finish it. She rejects his initial effort though, likening it to a childhood cliffhanger in which she was deceived by someone named Rocketman. Paul tries again, and this time Annie accepts and likes it. She then says she's going to play her Liberace CDs. Paul invites Annie to dinner and Annie accepts Paul's invitation. Buster claims that if he can't find Paul, he can find out what he wrote about in Misery, which is why he has purchased multiple of the book. During dinner, Paul suggests that he and Annie have a toast to misery. He sends Annie off to find a candle. While she's gone, he poisons her wine with the pill powder. When she returns and lights the candle, they begin the toast, but Annie knocks over the candle and, in the rush to pick it up, spills her poisoned wine. She profusely apologizes, pours more unpoisoned wine, and they do the toast. Paul is devastated but continues. Paul continues writing, progressing in the book with Annie reading the finished chapters to Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 by Liberace. Annie also fills in the missing ends as he completes each chapter. She's delighted by what he's completed, giddily begging him to reveal the ending, but he happily refuses. One night, Annie comes in rather depressed and states how she loves Paul and how she is afraid to lose him. Paul asks why he would lose her, and she replies that the book is almost finished and his legs are getting better and that he would be wanting to leave. Paul states that he likes it there, but Annie says she bets it isn't true. She pulls out a pistol, says she thinks about using it, then leaves the house, shambling out into the rain. While she is gone, Paul escapes his room once again and gets a knife from the kitchen to kill Annie. On his way back, he finds a scrapbook full of newspaper clippings that suggest she is a serial killer. She was suspected and tried for the murder of several infants as a maternity nurse, but the trial crumbled due to lack of evidence. Paul then gets back to his room and lays in bed, the knife hidden in the sling for his arm, and waits for Annie to come. When she finally does come, she heads upstairs and starts watching TV. Paul hides the knife under the mattress and goes to sleep. Annie gives Paul a hypodermic injection during the course of the night and attaches him to the bed. Annie informs him that she is aware of his travels from his room when he wakes up. Primarily because of the ceramic penguin, he always faces south. She informs him of the hobbling that South African miners who stole diamonds from the Kimberley diamond mines suffered as a penalty to keep them from escaping without jeopardizing their ability to do their jobs. She uses a sledgehammer to shatter his ankles after that. The next day, Buster, after seeing Annie going into the general store and yelling at a driver who cut her off, goes to the library and looks through a book of old newspaper stories and finds stories of the baby deaths and Annie's trial. He also finds a quote from a Misery novel he had written down that she said to the reporters. He goes to the general store and speaks with the proprietor, Pete, who says that Annie has bought considerable quantities of typing paper. Buster drives out to the Wilkes property, assuming that Paul is there. Before Paul gets there, Annie gives him another shot and conceals him in the basement. Buster hears Paul waking up and causes the basement grill to collapse over as he finishes searching the entire home and is ready to leave. Buster hurriedly went back inside the house and follows the voice of Paul. He locates Paul in the basement, but Annie kills Buster with a double-barreled shotgun. Paul overhears her stating that they must die together. Paul agrees, but only if they finish the book. Annie gives in grudgingly and goes to get his wheelchair. Paul exits the cellar surreptitiously carrying a can of charcoal lighter fluid. Paul informs Annie that he wants a glass of champagne, a cigarette, and a match after finishing the book, and Annie is eager to provide with his request. Annie offers Paul these things and says they need another glass for her. Ecstatic, she goes to grab the second glass. Paul ignites the book in front of Annie with the match after dipping it in lighter fluid. She tries to put out the flames, but Paul tosses the typewriter over her head. Paul and Annie go into a physical fight, during which Paul shoves burning papers into Annie's mouth. She stands up to confront him, but Paul stumbles her, causing her to strike her head on the typewriter and lose consciousness. After Paul crawls out of the room, Annie attempts to get him back inside after she awakens. Paul eventually kills her by striking her in the head with a nearby pig-shaped door stopper. Paul is in New York City a few months later, using a cane to help him walk. It's a prosthetic foot in the novel. The Higher Education of Philip Stone is his most recent book. Marcia said it has a chance to win several awards and is receiving positive reviews from critics. Though content, Paul maintains that he authored the book for himself. Marcia offers that Sheldon publish a non-fiction book about his experiences with Annie Wilkes, but he declines since he is clearly experiencing psychological damage from the encounters, and he frequently has hallucinations and dreams in which Annie is coming to get him in retaliation. Paul notices Annie when he says it and responds horrified. But in actuality, it was all a hallucination. A waitress informs Paul that she is a huge fan. Paul says in a modest way, "That is very sweet of you."